The eternal parent, wrapped in her ever-invisible robes, had slumbered once again for 7 eternities. Time was not, for it lay asleep in the infinite bosom of duration. So begins the secret doctrine. And if I may add, so shall it end. For as the Gita says, end and beginning are dreams. Many years ago, I was taking a graduate course at New York University taught by an Argentine professor in the Spanish language, already one step more difficult than usual. And he handed out a syllabus on the first day which contained something like 20 books. Mind you, we were all taking other courses, all of these to be read in a couple of months. And I thought, what is this man trying to do? This is utterly impossible. He must be mad, or at least Hispanic. And I mean that in no way against the Hispanic people, but they have this wonderful quixotic nature, don't they? I know and love the Hispanic people. So as I thought about this for a minute, when this professor began his class, he said, now you will see that the syllabus is quite impossible. But why should we try the possible? Now that's a very theosophical point of view. What we're going to attempt, not do, what we're going to attempt this morning is really quite impossible. But you were reminded or told by Dora in the last speech this morning, she mentioned about stretching the mind, didn't she? Mm-hmm. And what I hope to do, if I'm in any way successful, all I will have done will have been to interest you in stretching your mind toward eternal realities. That stretch, I believe personally, is potentially self-transformative. So what I'm to say may be mistaken in many ways. It won't be crystal clear. It'll be forgotten in 10 minutes. But if it interests you in pursuing this stretching for yourself, it will have been 100% successful. So let's start with this idea, revelation, the timeless flash. Let's start with revelation. I thought it would be interesting at first just to simply read a definition of revelation, which I took from the unabridged Merriam-Webster's Third New International Dictionary. Why do they make such long titles? Revelation, an act of revealing or communicating divine truth, especially God's disclosure or manifestation of himself or his will to man. Now there are 3 key points in that which I'd like to consider this morning. The first is the whole idea of divinity. What is divinity? Not that we're going to answer any of these questions, we're going to consider them. The second is divine truth. What do we mean by truth, first of all, especially divine truth? And thirdly, divine will. What is will, and especially divine will? Now, as all of you are quite aware, the great religions of the world have treated divinity rather differently. Many, many different ways, many ideas, aren't there, abroad about divinity. And yet, there are many, many common threads, as all theosophists are aware, in the great religions of the world. And some of these threads, I think 3 of them, are rather obvious to almost anyone without being a student of these things. The first is that while divinity may occasionally reveal itself, may or may not, according to the way we look at things, divinity is ultimately invisible and impossible to fully know. Isn't that sort of through all the great religions? You can't, in Judaism, you can't say the name of God, can you? The vowels are removed. It's unspeakable, isn't it? Islam, no images of God are permitted. Christianity, no man has seen God at any time. This idea of the utterly invisible, and in the great myths too, and a lot of the fairy tales even, God has so many names you can't know them all. So this idea that the ultimate divinity, or we might say in the Theosophical Society, ultimate reality, is ever incognizable, that it is not visible. The second very common thread through the great religions is that somehow this invisible, unspeakable reality is still the source of the whole visible universe. Isn't that a common idea? God created the world in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. In the Eastern religions, you have the idea of creating all out of myself. Nonetheless, that ultimate divinity is somehow or other responsible and is the source of all that is. And the third idea is that while this source of all has, while this invisible divinity has been and is the source of all, it remains itself unchanged. Heaven and earth may pass away, but I remain. You have that idea that somehow God is changeless. The ultimate reality does not change. Christ yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That's from obviously a Christian tradition. So we have those three ideas: invisibility, the source of the visible, and ever unmoved and eternal. Now, a theosophical view of the first of these common threads, the idea of the invisibility, the unspeakable quality or nature of this reality, is best summarized in the first fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from that, which in a way summarizes it. HPV says of that ultimate divinity, if I may put it that way, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. In the words of the Mandukya Upanishad, unthinkable, unspeakable. Now, if we had to put one word to that statement, I rather think that the word might be space. You know, Sinnett once asked the master K.H., what would remain if all else vanished? And without a moment's hesitation, K.H. said, space. That's rather obvious, isn't it, when we think about it? But we don't very often. Space, infinite, boundless, remains, unchanged, eternal. And yet, that space, from a theosophical perspective, is not emptiness. It is void of things. And yet, it is the potential for everything that can ever be. All that was, all that is, all that can be, potentially or even actually in existence, is within that space, isn't it? Before there was anything, there was space. And out of it, or within it, everything occurs. And when it's all finished, everything is reabsorbed. The one constant. So from a theosophical perspective, we can say that that divinity, now we're looking at divinity from a theosophical perspective. All the great religions would not agree with us. We would say that that divinity is, in one sense, if we can say anything about it at all, that it is that eternal space which, while being the source of all, is yet in itself ever unmoved and changeless. Now, there's a Christian hymn that actually echoes this. Mary and I were in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York some weeks ago, and this was they have a beautiful little candlelight Vespers, which is very lovely to go to. And we just saw that the first hymn contained this idea of the divinity being invisible and yet the source of all that is and still unchanged. And the line is so beautiful, I thought you would like to hear it. O God, creation's secret force, thyself unmoved, all motion's source. More theosophical you could not get, even at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Now we come to this idea of divine truth. We've said something about a theosophical way of looking at divinity. Now let's look at something of the idea of truth. Truth is often thought of, capital T, is often thought of as an aspect of divinity. Isn't that so? We have the Christian God saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So it's somehow associated with divinity, and especially, of course, when we name it as such by using the phrase divine truth. Now, to talk about truth, we must first differentiate in our mind between what I'm calling fact and what I'm calling truth with a capital T. We use the word truth to mean fact an awful lot of times. Facts are really descriptive states of the objective or subjective world. Let me give you some examples. New York is on the east coast and Los Angeles is on the west coast of the United States. Fact. When it all slips into the ocean, when the ocean level rises, it won't be a fact anymore. It takes the Earth approximately 24 hours to circle on its axis and 365 days to circle round the sun. A fact, which again will not exist at the end of the millennium. Jane is happy or sad today. That's a fact. It describes the subjective state, emotional state of Jane. She won't be happy forever. She won't be sad forever. Facts, right? They're facts. Now, truth, capital T, deals, I believe, with unchanging principles, such as gravity and three-dimensionality. Truth is associated, in my mind, with the nature of space itself. Gravity, for example, is a principle, isn't it, which is unseen. No one has ever seen gravity. Quite invisible. And yet, so far as we can tell, it's present everywhere in space and revealed to us by matter, the way matter behaves. Isn't that so? So we can accept that as a principle, universal, unseen in itself, yet we know it's there by the way matter responds, don't we? Three-dimensionality. Now, I'm not saying there aren't more dimensions. 4 or 5 n dimensions, very probably unlikely. However, in this physical world, 3 only. It's the nature of our space, isn't it? We can try as long as we want to build a 4-dimensional house. And if we're completely mad, we can believe we've succeeded. But we won't, because space won't let us. It's the nature of space. So when we're talking about principles, we're talking about, in a sense, the nature of this eternal space, existent space at least, since we can say nothing about the non-existent background real. Now, lest you think that these principles deal with such boring and cold things as matter and energy and three-dimensionality, with which we have no interest whatsoever, there are spiritual principles as well, enunciated by the great religious teachers of the world. For example, from Theosophical tradition, thou canst not travel on the path until thou hast become that path thyself. Live the life if you would come to the wisdom. Now, axioms such as these deal with eternal principles, just as eternal as the others that we mentioned. It's how things are. It's not a rule to follow. It's how things are. They can't be seen, the principles, but wiser personages among us have learned that these principles, dealing with consciousness now and developmental process, are eternal and unchanging. To put it simply, to summarize it about these principles, things don't fall up, and wisdom is not for sale. Now we come to the idea of divine will. It's a kind of, I hesitate to use this phrase, but I can think of no other more apt, a cosmic blueprint. Mind you, it isn't a piece of paper. But it's a kind of cosmic blueprint, I think myself. And HPB suggests that the universe is actually willed into being by the ever-to-be unknown power, that divinity that we spoke of first. Will, it seems to me, is associated with action. It isn't action itself, but it seems always associated with it, doesn't it? If we think about it. You will to do something, you intend to do something. It's sort of the impetus that sort of gets one going. And in a sense, will directs action. Isn't that true in our personal experience? We intend to do something, and our actions follow along the lines of the intent. Now, if you can sort of think of this divine reality as sort of willing a universe into existence, everything that happens will flow along the lines of that will. Three-dimensionality, in a sense, gravity, in a sense, is part of that will. But you can think of it, I think, more in terms of the great sweep of development of the universe, how it comes into being, its processes, and finally its dissolution. That whole thing, in a sense, is the cosmic blueprint. Now, a universe comes into being, at least physically, as subatomic particles, doesn't it? It gradually forms, doesn't it? In other words, that will is gradually revealed. The Christian religion says that, and many others I'm sure too. It's a kind of religion of revelation. It's sort of God gradually unfolds His will for humanity and whatever else. So you get this idea that, that this divine will, this blueprint, unfolds in time over incalculable eons from our personal human point of view. The subatomic particles gradually come together, form atoms, molecules, galaxies, solar systems, eventually the likes of you and me. And then in the long run, the whole thing, according to theory, is reabsorbed. Now we're going to deal with something even more impossible, but fun. We're going to use words which are totally time-bound to talk about the timeless. So it all has to be taken with a grain, or as I often say, a dose of salts. This whole evolutionary sweep from the formations of the Earth itself through the human experience to its conclusion, incalculable eons from our point of view, is somehow simultaneously present in its entirety in the eternal, subjective, and timeless whole. Now, to even begin to contemplate something that seems so paradoxical and absurd, we have to address the question of time. Address, not solve. K.H. said about time, time is something created entirely by ourselves. That's a little hard to swallow, isn't it? Interesting to think about. So let's look at time from a few different points of view. St. Augustine, one of the early Christian church fathers, was very intrigued with this idea of time. And he said at one point, what is it we're measuring when we say we're measuring time? If I can't measure the past because it isn't anymore. I can't measure the future because it isn't yet. And if I tried to measure the present, the minute I did so, it would be slipping into the past and wouldn't be present anymore. So what am I measuring? I regret to inform you I don't have the answer. But that's one of those questions that stretches the mind. We can, however, see more clearly in our experience something else. And that is that time at the subjective level is very, very different in our experience, isn't it? If we're sitting in the dentist chair, it may seem to be 3 hours. when we're having a good time at a rap session or whatever it else. Oh, a rap session might seem 3 hours too, mind you. I have been at those rap sessions. Not here yet. But our experience of time is different, isn't it, according to our states of mind. And then if we look at dreams, sometimes dreams are actually, I understand, just a few seconds or a few minutes long. And yet, what goes on in those dreams? Don't tell me. But an enormous amount of stuff happens, doesn't it? That couldn't possibly be in chronological time. Then look at the near-death experiences. Very many of the people who have those near-death experiences report that their entire life flashes before them in less than a second. They may be 70 or 80 years old when they have the experience. 70 or 80 years compressed into several seconds, less maybe even than 1 second. And they insist the whole life flashed before them. Time is a mystery, isn't it? And maybe it is created by ourselves. We're not denying motion, just time. Also, what about musicians? Radha mentioned Mozart, but Handel also. Handel says that the whole of Messiah, his great oratorio, flashed in his mind in a single flash, but it took him weeks to write it down, and it takes hours to sing it. The whole present in timeless reality. Now, eternity is very often thought of by people as endless time. I think we get that idea somehow partly from the Judeo-Christian scriptures, which were so history-oriented. But also, you know, we say forever, and then in case we think people didn't quite get it, we add, and forever. It's like saying dead or deader. So, eternity has nothing to do with time. It's not endless time. It's timeless. No one can tell anybody about that, but I am convinced that that is possible to, in some way, touch in the meditational experience. Now, what HPB says about time is very interesting also. She says, in the eternity, there is neither past nor future. Hence, for the inner ego, the three tenses merge into one, the present. Furthermore, the consciousness of time does not arise even in sleep. We don't realize how long we've slept, do we? Sometimes we can say, well, I think I slept a long time, but there isn't a sense of time during deep sleep, is there? Not during it. Only when we wake up we sort of reflect. No sense of time in the deep sleep. So she says if consciousness of time does not exist even in sleep, much less, therefore, can it exist in the essentially absolute. Can the sea be said to have a consciousness of time in its rhythmical striking on the shore or in the movement of its waves? And the Master K.H. adds this fascinating statement about time. He was rather exasperated with having to use English terms that couldn't capture the meaning he wanted to present to Sinnett, to whom he was writing. And in his exasperation, he said, three clumsy words, past, present, and future, miserable concepts of the objective phase of the subjective whole. They are about as ill-adapted for the purpose as an axe for fine carving. Wonderful sense of humor, the Master K.H. Refined sense of humor. Mine's crude, his is refined. Now we come to revelation again, and you might reconsider the definition that we gave in the beginning. An act of revealing or communicating divine truth, especially God's disclosure or manifestation of himself or his will to man. And we've said something about what we mean by divine from a theosophical view, what we mean by truth with a capital T, or divine truth, and something about what we mean by will. Now, how does revelation come about in our experience? We've had, all of us, something which is akin to revelation, I'm quite sure, and I will call that insight. We have understood, haven't we, something somewhere along the line. Not just learned that that's Main Street or whatever, that's a fact, but we have understood something, a mathematical principle, anything else in life, something about human nature. We've understood. That flash of understanding is an insight. And when we understand something, it's interesting how it comes to us. For 1 minute we do not know. Isn't that true? We don't know. We're puzzled. And when the insight happens, it happens in a flash. And then we know. And there's no time between those two. The flash is timeless. It comes from a timeless domain. It's dealing, in a sense, with those principles. So in a sense, even however minute, we've gotten a flash from that level of divine truth and understanding, you see. And it isn't connected to time. It doesn't gradually come into our mind. It hits it at once. Now, revelation might be is something like that, but it generally refers to a kind of flash of that cosmic blueprint, in part or in whole. In whole, it's called enlightenment. In part, it's more revelation or partial revelation. But that flash, just like the insight, first flashes where? On our mind. Isn't that true? And the mind reflects it, much the same as a mirror reflects. The reflection is not the truth, no more than the image in the mirror is the truth. We must remember that, I think. We have a reflection. We get an image, we get a picture. And HPB says over and over and over again, no picture will ever represent reality or the truth. No picture. Because that ultimate truth is unpicturable. So we get a reflection, we get an image, we get a picture. It's like seeing ourselves in a mirror. We've all done that, horror of horrors. And we look in the mirror and we see a partial revelation of ourselves, don't we? It's not the whole of us. Certainly isn't the subjective part of us. And we don't even see the whole of us physically when we look into the mirror. So we're getting a partial revelation, and we know that the image looking back at us isn't us. It's a reflection. So as St. Paul says, we see through a glass darkly, not fully. Now, if our minds were perfect, then the image would be as accurate as possible. But our minds aren't perfect. They're conditioned, aren't they? All of us. I don't think there are any exceptions to this, except the possible exception and likely exception of the adepts. Our minds are more like carnival mirrors. And some of them are really very distorted. But all of them are little. So we see the reflection, say it's the truth, and there's a little grain of the truth in it, but it's not the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's a distorted image coming back. So our minds are like those carnival mirrors. Now, if we were relatively free of personal conditioning, there is still the cultural conditioning to deal with. For example, let's take the near-death experiences again, because our minds are personally conditioned from our own personal experience, but also culturally from the traditions into which we've been born and are raised. Let's take the near-death experiences. Most of you are familiar, I'm sure, with them, and familiar with the idea that many, many people experience an extraordinary peace and wholeness and joy, which, if they are religiously oriented, they ascribe to Almighty God. Now, a devout Christian who experiences that in the near-death experience or at true death would likely, and many of them report, see Jesus. Why wouldn't they? It's their symbol of the spiritual. It means something to them. Dora talked about symbols earlier. It's their symbol of the spiritual, and every bit as valid as any other experience or symbol. So they find themselves in the arms of Christ, home at last. The devout Jew would not find himself or herself in the arms of Christ. Might be an angel, might be God's presence, but that wouldn't be their symbol, would it? But the experience would be the same, you see. So the world religions, the scriptures, the great scriptures of the world, I feel are a little bit like the NDEs in that respect. They're kind of revelations of this cosmic blueprint, but they're filtered through the personal and the cultural mind. So on the surface they look very different, don't they? Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all of them. We'd say, oh, well, they're very, very different. We know there are similarities, though. And they appear different on the surface, yet in their essence they are very similar in many respects, not all respects. Now, HPB suggests there's a reason for this. She feels that these common threads through the great world's religions are the result of what she calls a primeval revelation. She writes as follows: there was a primeval revelation, and it still exists. Born under whatever latitude, in the north, east, south, or west, man was nurtured under the same tree of knowledge. Whence, she asks, all this identity of ideas, if there was no primeval universal revelation? Now, in The Secret Doctrine, she has made an effort to sort of spell out the essence of that primeval revelation. And it takes a lot of words to do that. She spelled it out as cosmogenesis, the coming into being of the cosmos, of the visible world, to the coming into being and the development of humanity, anthropogenesis. Enormous, enormous epochs over time. But she has done it as clearly as possible for our time and in modern English. What she's tried to do is straighten out the mirror a little bit, make it a little clearer, so that that divine blueprint, cosmic blueprint, might be clearer and more accessible to humanity. But we must remember that even her much clearer picture is still a picture. And no image will ever be the truth. Because truth is beyond all pictures. Truth is beyond time, and the revelation of it is a timeless flash. Thank you.